Probate and estate fraud is the fastest growing area of fraud and embezzlement within families. It's even growing faster than divorce scams and divorce frauds. And the way it works is when somebody is deceased within a family or they're about to die, some family members may take it upon themselves to improperly convert assets to their own benefit rather than a proper distribution to the rest of the family. Here's a great article from Worth magazine for high net worth and affluent individuals, private client individuals. And a CFE, a certified fraud examiner, gives some really good tips in this article. And we're also a member of the ACFE, the American Certified Fraud Examiner Association. And this talks about how more and more people are reaching retirement age and living longer. And here's a good example of how this works and how you can prevent estate fraud. And if you are in a family where somebody's deceased or about to become deceased, how you can stop fraud and scams from happening to make sure everybody gets the fair share of this estate that they're supposed to. And here's some of the red flags. Many seniors who experience financial fraud do so at the hands of dishonest strangers. Sometimes an individual's own family takes advantage of them. We see this every single day. We probably get 100 or so calls a day, and 10 or 15 of them easily have to do with a family case where somebody is scamming money from the rest of the family. Because it's easy to get someone's financial information, because within a family, you may know bank accounts and assets. A stranger who's dishonest, it's going to be very difficult for a stranger to get your bank account information or the bank account information of the elder in your family. Other family members, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins can get that information. If you're at the house, you can just open the drawer and find the bank account, the bank book. Why is estate fraud so prevalent? Biggest reason, money. All it takes is a signature to access a bank account. What happens is other beneficiaries are left wondering after the person dies, I thought there was more money. What happened to all the money? How did this person become the executor of the estate? A lot of times somebody dies and all of a sudden there's a brother that becomes the executor of the estate. How did that happen? Often the people closest to the victim steal from the estate due to influence and manipulation. We'll talk about that momentarily. The perpetrator can be a family member, advisor, or healthcare worker. What are the red flags? The red flags are there any changes to a will executed right before they're going to die? And who benefits? So if somebody's wealthy and obviously they're in poor health and they may die soon, if all of a sudden the will gives all the money to the maid, well, what's the circumstances behind that? Did the person who died depend upon somebody who becomes a major beneficiary? So, for example, if there is a certain child of this decedent that all of a sudden lets them move in with them, gives them medical care, that may be totally legitimate. But if because of that, all of a sudden they get the lion's share of the estate, you want to make sure that that's exactly what the person wanted. Is one of the people excluded for no reason? If you were a member of a family and a person dies and you expected that you'd be considered in the will, if you're left out, how come? What's the reason for that? Does the will benefit other people that are not in the family? Why is that? Here's the examples of estate fraud. One family member takes money from the parent's bank account for personal benefit. That's the obvious thing. We see that all the time. They take money out of the account or they empty the account right before or right after they die. So when it goes into probate, the will goes to court. There's no money to divide up. A person who's left out of the will destroys that will to put it into probate, so now they get an equal share. That's another thing that we see happening. Some person outside the family, caretaker, influences the dying person to put the money into their name or to give them a power of attorney on an account. Examples. This particular author talks about a few examples. We'll tell you about some that we've seen specifically in our agency recently. One of the most common examples is during the course of the life of the person who has the money before they die, there are activities that happened where accounts are made vulnerable. They're infiltrated. So somebody has, let's say, $1 million in a bank account, and there's a child of that person that goes and takes out 50 grand, 100 grand, 200 grand over the course of time right before. So now when the person dies, the bank account only has 450,000 in it, and that's all that goes into the will. Unless you go back to look at the assets of what they were before, shortly before the death, you won't know that that money was gone. You also want to go back to at least before the person died, because sometimes what will happen is the fraudster, the scammer, will wait until that person dies, and then the day after, they'll go write a check for $300,000 and take the money out. Because by the time the person dies, there's a funeral, there's a will, there's a reading of the will, and then you do an asset search, that account says $600,000. Nobody knows that money left unless you go back before the person died. In addition, you want to make sure that any signatures on asset transfers are legitimate. Was there a deed to a property that was transferred? Was there a mortgage taken out? Was there a loan taken out? Or even was there a loan forgiven to one of the descendants? You want to make sure all that's legitimate. Sometimes a child of a person who's deceased will have a loan owing that person money. Look, let me borrow $200,000 for a down payment on a house, and they pay him back, and all of a sudden that person dies, and magically that loan disappears, right? There's a signature that cancels the loan. There's a million ways to do estate fraud and probate fraud. We've seen it all. We've seen children steal from each other over $10,000, $15,000. It doesn't have to be a large amount. We've seen children take items from a safe deposit box. So when somebody dies, they go in the house, they get the key for the safe deposit box, run over to the bank, take out anything of value, put it back like nothing happened. We've seen children take out mortgages on property owned by the deceased person to get cash out. So you want to follow the flow of funds. You want to follow where all the money's going to make sure that in the period of time shortly before the person died, there's no funny business going on with these assets, whether they're corporate assets, business assets, vehicles, bank accounts, obviously, retirement accounts, brokerage accounts, and even something like a vehicle. Sometimes what will happen is somebody will have a car, and right when the person dies, they'll sign over the title to somebody else and that car disappears. What happened to Grandpa's car? I don't know, and he must have sold it. Right? You want to do a title search on that vehicle to find out who it was sold to, when it was signed, is the signature valid, to make sure that the rest of the estate gets the proper distribution of family assets, because that's what the deceased person wanted. They didn't want somebody to steal their money and not give it to the rest of the family. So whatever you're entitled to, you should make sure that you get, but also the rest of the family gets, because the person who died does not want their money, did not want their money to be distributed improperly. They wanted it to go to a certain place, and it's against the wishes and the honor of that person to let it go otherwise. It also will tell you where you stand with those family members. So you want to know if there's a family member that has stolen money basically from you and other people, you want to know that, because in the future you may have close dealings with that person. You may have, your kids, stay over there. You may have other financial dealings with them. Maybe there's another spouse that's still living that may die someday. You don't want to be unaware that a person in your family is committing fraud against their own family members. A lot of times the person does it because they feel like they're going to get away with it. They feel like no one's ever going to know. Because, as an example, you see this box with all the cash in it on the screen. If Grandpa had $10,000 in cash in his closet, if that money disappears, maybe nobody knows about it. Maybe there's only one or two children know about it. Maybe some of the children live out of state. Maybe some of the children, have not as much close contact with the decedent, and that's the way that the money is stolen. Regardless, you don't want to leave it up to the executor of the estate, because they might be in on it. You want to make sure you have good investigations, good asset tracing, have an attorney if possible, review all this. Even though these are expenses, you'll know that things are done correctly, and any honorable member of this family would not be opposed to having this audit and this forensics done on the estate. Because if somebody's against it or they're offended by it, that just means that maybe they have a guilty conscience and don't want to get caught stealing money from you and the rest of your family.